I hope that I've convinced you that social factors, particularly inequalities, have a significant impact on health. You've also heard that there are plausible mechanisms for many of these impacts. If you're interested in improving public health, the next question is whether interventions that target these social factors are effective. The overall answer is yes. However, the evidence base is surprisingly weak in showing the impact of interventions, such as improved housing, education and welfare, on health outcomes. Most of the evidence comes from observational studies rather than trials of interventions. For example, there's a strong relationship between maternal education and vaccination in children. I worked with one of my students on a systematic review of 37 studies. We showed that children were 2.3 times more likely to be fully vaccinated if their mothers had received at least secondary education. But it was impossible to show that it was the education of mothers that had caused the increase in vaccination due to confounding factors such as overall investment in health and education. So the challenge is to find good research on structural interventions. One good example is a trial of support for disadvantaged young children in the United States. In the 1970s, children were randomly assigned to either receive intensive early years support or standard care. 30 years later, those who had received the intervention had significantly lower risk factors for cardiovascular and metabolic diseases. The effects were particularly strong in males and showed the potential for a sustained impact from a structural intervention. An evidence synthesis of interventions to address social determinants of health showed a mixed picture. This was a review of systematic reviews, and it showed some evidence of a positive impact on health from structural improvements in housing, employment, transport and food supply. The overall conclusion was that there were too few studies of social interventions, with the majority being focused on individual-based approaches. Do you think it's surprising there are not many strong studies in this area? There are several reasons, including the fact that improving education, housing or introducing a minimum wage are not usually thought of as health interventions. Many policymakers would feel uncomfortable doing trials, which are experiments, because it would mean only offering these inherently valuable interventions to part of the population and withholding them from others. Michael Marmot, who I talked about in an earlier lecture, argues that in order to reduce health inequalities, we must reduce social inequalities, and it's difficult to argue with that.